Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to check in on these two worm bins over here. Two worm bins that have been, up until now, over their entire 270-day lifespan, the focal point of a little test that we were conducting. A test that already started prior to the worms being moved into these containers, which was an attempt to break down a compostable bag, a bag that was labeled as compostable. And after not only the amount of time that bag spent in the previous home that these worms lived in, as well as the 270 days spent in these containers, well, not in these containers, but in this container here, container number 1, we finally decided the last time, 12 days ago, it was time to bring an end to that test. And at that same time, during the last check-in, we transitioned these systems to what I refer to as small particle size feeding, which means not giving them full-size kitchen scraps, but rather stuff that's bite-sized, stuff like my worm chow and coffee. And that type of feeding regimen is going to continue today in this check-in. So I'm going to get those bins up on the bench and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. So now we already touched on the age of the bins, 270 days of age. The types of worms living in these systems are European nightcrawlers. My abbreviation for that is ENC. And just like the last check-in 12 days ago, where it had been a 12-day feeding interval prior, once again we're coming back to these bins 12 days later to give them now feeding number 24, because they've been fed 23 times. So let's get to work on this. I'm sensing a huge amount of moisture in the air. It's super humid. And I think the forecast did call for a break in the humidity tomorrow, but today, as was yesterday, a super humid day, which generally causes the worm bins to hang on to their moisture content rather than being able to dry off. Because those paper coverings that we had on here were really meant to enable the systems to kick off some of their moisture content, but it really hasn't been happening. Even those feeding zone indicators, those coffee filters that were out here, they generally get quite dry just by sitting out here on the top of the surface of the material, covered only with a couple sheets of newspaper. But even now they're quite damp, and some of the moisture trying to leave the system is getting captured in that paper, and maybe leaving the system and evaporating away, but I sense that not a lot of that is really happening. So I do see some leftover bits of food items here. These might be what remains of some stems of banana, and that's what this might be here as well. This stuff over here I believe might be the rinds of cantaloupe melon. It has this sort of distinct appearance to it. And I think another thing that was left over from the last check-in was the peel of potato, because the prior feeding included potato peels, and I believe that there was still a good bit of potato peel still remaining. I don't know if we're going to bump into much of that, but this right here might be some of that. And that's fine. I figured we'd transition them to a small particle size food menu, diet, whatever you want to call it, from now into the foreseeable future, so that we're not really left with any leftover food bits going forward. Let them break down what remains as far as food scraps from past feedings, but any new feedings that we give them going forward should be things that are not going to really leave any leftovers. And then we'll eventually get to the point, hopefully, where we'll have a really nice batch of finished castings on our hands to harvest, and then we can move the worms onto new systems at some point. There are a couple items in these bins though that I doubt will have time enough to break down between now and the point in time in the near future when we finally get around to harvesting their castings. Those things are generally placed right smack in the middle, and I'm already bumping into one of them here. Here we have the husk from a mango seed. Whether or not there's still any of the seed inside the husk, I don't know. unlikely. And if there is, I'm just shaking it out at this point. At this point, they're really just left with breaking down this husk, which is a fairly tough, slow composting item. So I wouldn't expect to see it gone. I would expect that it would probably just go with the worms into their new home when the time comes to migrate them into a new place and harvest their castings. And I can't remember whether it was here in bin number 1 or bin number 2, but one of the systems also had the stem of a pumpkin in it. So those things will continue to try to keep them together, and we'll just place them near the middle of the bin so that they're easy to zero in on and locate in future check-ins. As for the rest of the remaining bits of food that we're encountering as we go, the peel of potato, the peel of cantaloupe, the stems of bananas, those things are just going to keep getting blended in. And the other thing that we added last time was a couple coffee filters. Those coffee filters that I use as feeding zone indicators that were draped out across the top. There were actually 2 of them down underneath the surface included with the feeding. So I laid in a coffee filter onto which went the coffee. I laid in another coffee filter onto which went the worm chow, and it does seem like the worms have done away with it. I mean, these are night crawlers, so it's not too surprising that they're enjoying that carbon-based food item. So here, since this is bin number 1, it isn't too surprising that we might still bump into scraps of the compostable bag, and I'm fairly certain that this is what we're finding here. We always did our best to try to maintain the compostable bag as a single object, but there were always instances when it seemed like my rough handling of the material where the bag was resulted in me hearing sounds and feeling the sensation of something breaking or tearing. And I believe that that might have been on a couple occasions. So it's not too surprising that we probably would encounter at least one other large scrap of the compostable bag here in the system. And I think I actually sort of bumped into 3 separate pieces right here, which I've now placed together out here on the surface just to give the stuff a moment or two so that the worm that I see right there, and maybe any other worms that might be tangled up in the material, will sense the bright lights and leave. Dive down out of the compostable bag material and dive down into the bed to flee the bright lights. And while we're waiting for that to happen, we can just give bin number 2 here a similar treatment of just tilling up the material, giving it all a good stir. Stuff like this, I don't know, a stick. How did this stick get in here? Usually I'll extract large items like this, which I don't really expect to see break down in my worm bins. And it is a little bit unusual that something like that would have ended up in here and I wouldn't have encountered it and extracted it in past check-ins, but stuff like that I really wouldn't expect to see break down, so out it comes. And you know, it really does make me wonder if it might be a good idea to include some sort of carbon-based stuff along with their feeding, the way I did last time with those 2 coffee filters that were placed in alongside the coffee and the worm chow, because I don't see any signs of that, which suggests to me that not only were the coffee and the worm chow consumed in their entirety, but also those bits of carbon-based material, paper products in this case. I'll typically be avoiding the addition of large objects, such as whole food items, anymore when I'm driving towards harvesting the castings, so that they can really focus on breaking down residual bits of leftover stuff. See, here again, I find it fascinating that the large stick or a large object like this, which seems to me like a material that is not compostable. I mean, I was able to tear it, but whatever it's made of just doesn't seem to me like a material that's going to break down. You know, if it was breaking down, it would show some signs of wear and breakdown, but I see none. So my tendency is to remove it, but how it ends up in the worm bins, I don't know. Perhaps it was just something on a larger chunk of cardboard that I had used at some point recently, but sometimes it does seem a little bit of a mystery to me how certain things wind up in my worm bins. So I think we've, at this point, zeroed in on all the large items, such as the pumpkin stem and the husk of the mango seed in both systems. And I think we've also provided sufficient time for this little bit of residual compostable bag to be evacuated of any wormies. I see a wormy here on my index finger, so I'm going to try not to include them with the compostable bag, but I am still hanging on to what remains of the compostable bag that I extracted last time we were in here 12 days ago. And perhaps we'll just hang on to it just in case we continue to bump into any more stuff. So I think, sort of like we did last time, I'm going to open up a small opening near the middle of the bin in both systems, into which we can drop their coffee and worm chow feeding. And I am wondering if we might want to treat them to a little bit more of a carbon-based food item to accompany those more nitrogen-dense food items that we plan to give them. So why don't we just treat them to these feeding zone indicators that we deployed last time. These were brand new, or at least brand new to being in a worm bin. But since they've been in the system as feeding zone indicators over the past 12 days, they're probably infiltrated with all kinds of microorganisms to give them a nice jump start on being broken down. And you can even see on them how they're developing a little bit of mold growth as well. And I assume that that's got to do with the fairly large amount of moisture in the air with the humidity going on here. And I think we are being a little bit more generous today with the coffee than we were last time, but that's fine. Let's not forget to also sprinkle in a little bit of my worm chow to accompany the coffee, because I just like to do that, keep things interesting. But before we backfill the feeding zones, let's return these slow composting objects to the feeding zones so that they might even continue to get a little bit more attention from the worms than if they were just out there amongst the regular material elsewhere. Perhaps by being right where the most recently added food is, maybe those objects will get a little bit more attention than if they were elsewhere. And as for the other food bits we're encountering here and there as we go, I'm not worrying too much about them. We're just kind of skimming past those as we go. And I guess at this point, what I can do is just allocate a couple replacement feeding zone indicators to drape over where we last fed. Not that we would really have any need for finding our way back to the last feeding zone, but it's more of a little bit of a tradition here in my wormery to mark where we last fed. So I'm keeping to tradition while at the same time using these as opportunities to get rid of stuff like coffee filters. So that's it for our check-in now with these 270-day-old European nightcrawler systems getting feeding number 24, coming along pretty nicely. And perhaps at some point in the near future, once the material in these bins starts to become a little bit drier, a little bit more crumbly, maybe we can start thinking about getting the worms out of here, separating the worms from their castings, and harvesting the material and moving the worms on. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.